Oh, I just love the detail and the thinking behind it. So if those tusks can reach down to the ground, why not attach a load of wood and spikes and stuff to them? So my objection to this weapon is it is clearly too unwieldy. If you actually watch him using the weapon, clearly he finds it unwieldy.
This is Matt Easton, a teacher of historical European martial arts who specializes in both longsword and saber fencing. We got him to react to the Battle of the Pelennor Fields and more in The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King, giving us his expert HEMA opinion on just how realistic this movie is.
So I know this is super pedantic, but it's always really bothered me with the Riders of Rohan that they have these nice round shields, look like kind of Anglo-Saxon Viking era shields, and they just hang on the horses. I know for practical reasons it's because the riders are all holding the reins in their hand. Historically speaking, if you've got a shield and you're on horseback, you'd usually hold the shield. Otherwise, it's not doing an awful lot of useful stuff there. You could say that they've just got them for when they fight on foot. Yeah, okay, but certainly if you're having arrows shot at you and lances coming at you and things like this, holding the shield is generally a good idea. So I have complained about the fact that Theoden rides along, sort of knocking all of the lances with his sword, but do you know what? It's not going to greatly damage the lances. I don't think it will really damage his sword. He's hitting wood with a steel blade. If it's good steel, there shouldn't be any issues with the edge, and it's not like he's chopping at the lances and putting big notches in them or anything. I don't really understand the point of it. I don't know, maybe it's just a sort of recognizing all of his troops in the front line, but I actually think it looks quite cool. I don't have a big issue with it. So they're riding into this arrow storm, and you can see those shields just hanging down by their legs, doing nothing at all. But it would have been really, really useful to have been holding those shields right now. So I've got a bit of an issue with the effectiveness of the bows here on the horses. The fact is, historically speaking, we know that horses could take several arrows and still be running around. In fact, if we come forward to the Gunpowder Age, in the 19th century, there's records of horses being shot more than once and still riding around with their riders on them. So horses are big, tough animals, and one arrow does not magically make a horse instantly die or fall over necessarily, as shown here. So yet again, the arrows are made out to be a little bit more potent than I think the reality. The reality is the horses might start to go out of control, might go a bit crazy, they might bump into each other, this kind of stuff, but they wouldn't instantly just die. So again, here we've got the superpowered horses, and the problem is there's a complete paradox, because in literally the scene, with the same scene, but just like a few seconds before, we've seen arrows felling a horse with one shot. So these are super fragile horses that one arrow brings them down instantly. And now we've got horses crashing through orc bodies, never tripping over, never sort of grinding to a stop, and just plowing on at very high speed. And it just, these two things don't go together very well. The fact is that, you know, horses, yes, they are big, powerful animals. Yes, they can crash into infantry and knock people flying, but at some point they lose momentum or they trip and fall over. Like I say, horses do trip and fall over, not that uncommonly. It's quite relatively easy for a horse to fall over. And this is again mentioned in historical sources. Anything that might trip them will bring them down with the rider as well. So I think I love it as a scene. I sort of love it and hate it at the same time. It's like the horses are on one hand too weak and on one hand too powerful. So I absolutely love the use of these giant versions of elephants with their fighting platforms on top. And again, this is something which absolutely has its basis in history. Now, everyone's heard about Hannibal. So he used a certain type of, I believe, bush elephant from Africa, which no longer exists. So they tend to be a bit smaller than modern African elephants. These obviously are gigantic. But nevertheless, people have been fighting from the back of elephants since antiquity, and it's been done in India like forever. This is not a fantasy concept. This is a real world idea, just scaled up and made more fantastical. On the fortification, they have an assortment of weapons, and again, this has its basis in history. Typically, you'd have someone with a long polearm, you'd have someone with a bow, you'd have the person who's driving the elephant, a mahout, it'd be called in India. So you'd have a variety, a team of people working with different types of weapon, different strengths. Now, understandably, if you're on horses facing these as potential enemies, how do you fight them? Well, interestingly, again, we know how people on horseback fought against people on elephant back, Persia and India and elsewhere, and some horses were specifically trained to rear up, and we've got images from India, from manuscripts, of the cavalrymen riding their horse so the horse rears up their hooves to kick at and almost stand at the side of the elephant, so the rider of the horse with their lance can stab the rider of the elephant. However, we can't do that here because these are normal size horses with giant size elephants. How on earth do you fight against the humans who are way up there? Well, I guess the answer is you probably try and fight the creatures more than the humans. Oh, I loved when I first saw this, and still, I absolutely love the detail and the thinking behind it. If you've got these giant elephants, what's their primary mode of attack apart from just walking and crushing things? They're massive tusks, mammoth-like tusks. If those tusks can reach down to the ground, why not attach a load of wood and spikes and stuff to them, and they can just literally sweep away opponents. I love the thought that goes behind it, and it seems believable. So we see a detail here of arrows being shot into both the legs and the underbelly of the giant elephants. Frankly, if these are normal power, even quite heavy power bows, they are not going to penetrate deeply enough into this type of elephant's hide to do any discernible damage to it whatsoever. So the fact that it's peppered with dozens or even hundreds of arrows is completely realistic, I think. Elephant skin's super thick, isn't it? And the fact is that these arrows and these bows are designed for killing other humans or human-sized people. They're not designed for taking down a creature of this size. I love that detail. You can't take out the vehicle, take out the driver. Lovely. I have always had a huge problem with that little part of this scene because, as we've seen, arrows, that it's peppered with arrows, have done nothing at all. Eowyn, with a couple of swords, will not be able to penetrate that hide deeply enough to do anything even noticeable to this creature. She won't even cut through the hide. There are shields made of elephant, rhino, and hippopotamus hide, and they are incredibly thick. It was noted during the Sudan War of the 1880s that a Sudanese rhino hide shield would stop a pistol bullet. Okay, they're bulletproof. You cannot put a sword edge through the hide of this creature and injure its flesh or tendons or muscle or anything else underneath. Her blows would have no impact on this creature at all. So really nice use of what we call traversing footwork there. Moving to the side, something comes at you, you move to the side of it. And that was actually really nicely choreographed and believable. In terms of the cuts, I also really like that they realized this is a very large creature's neck that she's cutting through. So she's not going to do it with one cut. Doesn't matter how big or strong you are, you would not get through that amount of meat and a spine with one cut. In reality, for most people, it'd probably take three or four cuts would be a guess, with good cutting. Yeah, she sidesteps and cuts. It all looks completely acceptable, completely believable. I like the effects that they've done. It looks right. It looks, you can buy into it. Just to comment briefly on the Witch King's armor, that it's very, very nicely done. You can see that it's proper metal armor, and certainly those gauntlets, again, are modeled on German Gothic gauntlets from the late 15th century, from about 1480 to 1510. Now, his weapon, that's a different kettle of fish. So what we would call this is a flail. Sometimes some people would refer to this as a morning star, but the more correct term for it is a flail. In its original idea, a flail was a wheat threshing device that used by farmers. Over time, when farmers were pushed into military service, they sometimes used agricultural tools, and it was noted that the flail had certain advantages and was occasionally taken to war, and they made war versions of flails by adding iron to the wooden head. This, however, is a far more specialized object in that it's a long chain with a mace head at one end and a relatively short handle. Some people have said that these didn't exist historically. In fact, they did, or at least they're shown in period art. Disadvantages of them: they're unwieldy, not very easy to control. You can't change direction with them very easily. So you can't, with a sword, you could go 1-2 around here. You can't do that with a flail. You have to continue in a motion and then come round. You can't really parry. You can't block with them very easily. So they need to be used with a shield usually. So there's lots of disadvantages. The one big advantage to them is they're very unpredictable for the opponent to defend against. So for example, if you put a block in the way, if you put a weapon up to block, or you put a shield in the way, there's a good chance that that flail will swing around the back side of it and either hit you in the face or head, or actually, as we found in experimentation, if you stick a shield in the way, it can actually lap around the shield and hit the arm holding the shield, which would be extremely painful. They can wrap around weapons that have been put up to block them, and you can pull them away. So they've got some advantages, but they're fairly unwieldy. And this is a massive, oversized example. Real ones never would have been this big. So my objection to this weapon is it is clearly too unwieldy. Now, many people, in response to me, when I've mentioned this previously, have said to me, but it's the Witch King. He can have a massive and ludicrously heavy weapon. But no, if you actually watch him using the weapon, clearly he finds it unwieldy. It is too unwieldy for him. The reason that Eowyn is able to move around and dodge pretty easily is because he can't move his weapon fast enough. And this is a perfect example of why real medieval swords aren't very heavy. They are only as heavy as they need to be to get the job done, but they still need to be quick and nimble. And that's the problem here. His flail is clearly too big and too heavy for him, and is making him a worse fighter, a worse combatant. He would have been more dangerous if he'd just used a standard sword. If someone feels the need to spin their entire body around in circles, then you know that fundamentally they can't really handle that weapon very well.
Die now.
So we saw a nice example there of a stab where the armor wasn't. And when we look at armored fighting, when we look at the manuals and treatises from the period, absolutely the back of the knee is a prime target.
For Frodo.
So, of course, they've done the one thing that they absolutely shouldn't have done, allowed themselves to be surrounded. Just like, why did they do this? There were so many other options available to them. Seems kind of crazy to me. The problem is sprinting with, especially in armor with a shield and weapons and stuff like this, is one of the worst and silliest ways to approach an enemy force. Really, they should all stick together in a group, get their shields locked together, and yes, absolutely, they can move relatively fast then as one group into the enemy to try and force them back or create an opening in them to break through and prevent themselves from continuing to be surrounded. But sprinting at high speed and all straggling out and spreading out just means that they're going to die in ones and twos instead of fighting as a cohesive unit. So it always made me laugh slightly that when you've got something the size of a troll, you think how strong a bear is. Okay, this is something that's like 2 or 3 times the size of a bear. Aragorn, yes, okay, he's supposed to be stronger than a normal human. He is special. Parrying a blow from a creature of this size with that amount of muscle mass and the amount of momentum in his weapon, you don't parry, you don't straight block, but you just avoid the blow. I think trying to encounter the opponent's weapon when they and their weapon are so big and so heavy is just asking for a disaster, I think. I think it was hugely influential and important, but it also, in terms of the fighting and the combat and stuff, there was a degree of authenticity to it. They used real steel swords made by a good quality sword maker. They used armor that was inspired by historical examples, some of it from the ancient world, some of it medieval and Renaissance. You could clearly see some of the historical inspirations there, those German Gothic gauntlets or the almost Greek hoplite inspired Gondor helmets. The bows, for example, you could see longbows, you could see recurve bows, you could see crossbows, the siege equipment, the battering ram, the ladders with the hooks on. All of this stuff was taken or inspired by real history and then given a fantasy twist. It wasn't made up out of thin air, and it lends an air of real believableness to it all, and the quality as well. Like I say, the craftsmanship, that the lovingness with which that chainmail was made, or those helmets were made, the breastplates, beauty of the swords, the fact that still today people are still buying Lord of the Rings replica swords to hang on the wall because they're so iconic. You instantly recognize Aragorn's swords to Anduril or his previous sword, or you recognize Glamdring, Gandalf's sword, you recognize Sting. They're so iconic, such an iconic design. It's a fascinating back and forth between historical inspiration, then fantasy, and then fantasy inspiration of things which are supposed to be historical.
For more Lord of the Rings, make sure to watch our previous videos with Matt reacting to the Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers, or our Expert Reacts playlist.